Alrighty, we are now going to talk very quickly about Unit 4. Unit 4 is the rise of transoceanic interconnections and the rise of the global world from 1450 to 1750. This is a very dense unit. There's a lot of information, but we are going to go through this relatively quickly. Just like Unit 3, there are themes that show up that are across all of the topics, and I'm really going to make sure and highlight those. I recommend that as I go through this, you are taking notes somehow, whether it be by hand or maybe you're typing notes, whatever works best for you. But it's important to sort of interact with all of this information. So 4.1 is, well, just to go back a little bit, Unit 4 is talking now about maritime empires. So Unit 3 was land-based empires, Safavid, Ottoman, Mughal, Russia, France, China, and Unit 4 is maritime empires. So empires that grow because of trade across water. That is like Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. These European nations rise, first of all, because of technological innovations. So, we're going to talk about why Europe gets involved in this maritime trade and how technology helped them. So, first of all, maritime trade, that's trade across water, had existed for a really long time, particularly in the Indian Ocean. But remember, Europe was really kind of battling their own wars and sort of kept to themselves when we're talking about like the Mongol Empire and stuff like that, and even the rise of the Ottomans and Mughals. Europe wasn't interested. But they start to see all the money these nations are making from trade with Asia, and they want to get in on that. A big reason that exploration begins is because Europe is trying to find a waterway to Asia. You have to know that. They start searching for water routes to Asia because there is a lot of conflict in the Indian Ocean over who gets to trade there. Not who gets to trade, but who gets to hold power there. So we see things like the Omani-European rivalry, where Portuguese trading forts are being challenged by local Indian Ocean people, and they don't want Europeans encroaching on this trade. So Christopher Columbus strikes out with the help of the Spanish Empire in search of a new waterway to Asia. People like Prince Henry the Navigator really encourage maritime exploration and trade, and that's key. These European nations, the government is paying for exploration and eventually colonization, all because they know that it's going to help them get rich. Prince Henry the Navigator is the first to really sort of encourage this exploration, and that puts Portugal further away from Portugal than other European nations had ever gotten. Christopher Columbus discovers the New World, notice that's in quotations, for Spain, and that really encourages other European nations to try and find a waterway as well. This new pattern of long-distance trade and colonization leads to the rise of what is called maritime empires, empires based on sea travel and trade rather than just land expansion. I'm These innovations, I'm not going to read them to you specifically because I feel like we talked about them in depth. These are the reason that Europeans were able to travel so far. We see things like the compass and the astrolabe that make navigation easier. They learn about geography and tide patterns so they know when to travel. Ships are lighter and faster and stronger than they had ever been before. The astronomical knowledge of the stars and the moon and basically where people were situated on the world it advances rapidly. Something key to note about these innovations is that it's not like Europeans made all of this up. Most of these things were taken from classical Roman, Muslim, or Asian technology, and they were either improved upon or utilized by Europeans to make trade and travel faster and easier. They could survive in rougher waters. They could get further away from land. Basically, it was the perfect storm. Europe wanted to trade. All of these technological innovations happened, and they were able to get further away from home than ever before. The long-term results, just on a very basic level of the age of exploration, is that obviously new empires started to come about. Existing empires like Portugal became stronger than they had ever been. At the same time, gunpowder comes in from China, and that sort of puts a military force behind this exploration. So now it's not like people just go somewhere and look. They go and they use gunpowder weapons to stay. The biggest thing well, not the biggest, but one of the biggest themes that we see from exploration is the spreading of new cultures to new places. Obviously, because of the transatlantic slave trade, African culture is spread around the world in a way it had not been before. European culture comes to the New World and essentially wipes out existing cultures. And we start to see syncretic beliefs and syncretic communities and diasporic communities exist around the world in the way that they had not been before. We also start to see some of these land-based empires grow from Unit 3 because of the advances of the European maritime empires. Places like Russia start to see the success of other places and begin to consolidate and grow their military in a way they hadn't prior. So that's all 4.1. Basically, just innovation, why Europeans traveled. They traveled to find a waterway to Asia because they wanted to cash in on the silver, or not the silver yet, the spices and the trade that was happening, the luxury goods. And they were able to do so because of this technology. 4.2 is all about the causes of exploration. So, what were the main causes and effects of state sponsored? State sponsored, that means government sponsored expansion. So let's talk about the role of states. So at the very beginning of maritime exploration, we see Italy start to assert its dominance. It was situated in a place that allowed it to control waterways between Europe and Asia, which meant that they controlled the flow of goods between the two regions, and in turn, the price. Europe didn't like that Italy had this much power, so places like Spain, Portugal, France, and England start to search for new water routes. Don't forget about that European-Omani rivalry that we talked about in 3.1. There's also some disputes about Europe trying to get over there. So basically, they just got to find a new way. They do this for a couple of reasons, mostly the money, gold, but also because Christian zeal was very big in Europe at the time. You know, religion was a huge force, and they wanted to spread Christianity. Also, we see European rivalries. Spain doesn't want Italy to be more powerful than them. Portugal doesn't want Spain or Italy to be more powerful than them. Great Britain doesn't want anybody to have more power than them. So everybody wants that glory. So it is the search of gold and silver, the desire to assert European dominance, and the desire to spread Christianity that encourages these European nations to spread. Something you're going to hear me talk about a lot in this unit is the idea of mercantilism. And that is just an economic policy that became prominent in Europe at the time. It essentially said two things. One, sell more than you buy. Export more than you import, because you want to have gold and silver in your national bank. That's number one most important thing to these European nations. The other thing was that once you start colonizing, mercantilism says that all trade colonies do should benefit the mother country. No nation supported exploration as heavily as Portugal. And by saying that, I just mean that the government of Portugal paid for exploration in a way that other states didn't, especially at the time. Three important Portuguese people were Prince Henry the Navigator, who was the first European monarch to finance sea travel. We've already talked a little bit about him. Bartholomew Diaz, who sailed around the tip of Africa, and Vasco da Gama, who sailed a little further east than Diaz all the way to India. So Portugal establishes ports in India, trading ports, and this is the first step towards the creation of a trading post empire. Remember, trading post empires are based on little trading forts that control a lot of trade and make a lot of money, as opposed to expanding over land like the land-based empires from Unit 3 did. They controlled a lot of land. Maritime empires, especially in the beginning, didn't, but they controlled trading posts, and that's how they made a lot of money. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about Portugal. So in the early 1500s, Portugal was superior to other European nations as far as their navigational technology. If you look at the map that I've posted on the slide, you can see that Portugal is a teeny tiny country. So their dominance at this time was pretty significant. We see guys like Afonso de Albuquerque, who won a battle against Arab traders to win the port of Malacca. Remember, all the way from Unit 2 or 3, Unit 2, Malacca was so important in the Indian Ocean because it was the only way that you could travel between different parts of that world. So it was almost like buying the door. That was the example that we used last unit. In order to trade on the Indian Ocean, you had to go through the door. That was Malacca. So whoever controlled that had a lot of power as far as the money they could charge to let people through that Strait of Malacca. This allowed Portugal to dominate Indian and African coasts as far as trade. Portugal went as far as China. They didn't really change China very much, but missionaries followed them. As the missionaries moved into China, initially they were able to convert quite a lot of people. China doesn't like this because Confucian policies were the most important thing to them at the time, and Confucianism helped them consolidate their rule, and Christianity was a threat to that. So we'll see later on that China eventually closes their doors to trade in a lot of ways, and it's because of this influx of missionary activity. Again, Portugal established a trading post empire. This ensured that they had a monopoly over Indian Ocean trade. Monopoly is a key word for this unit. It is essentially when a company or a country controls all trade or all activity in an area. Monopolies become something that governments will give to a company, and we'll see that with the rise of joint stock companies. Portugal was the first trading post empire, again, an empire built on trade rather than land. And the reason that Portugal had to be a trading post empire was because they were such a small nation that they did not have enough people to really control the land mass that some of these other empires did. So they had to just make small forts. That eventually becomes Portugal's downfall. They just don't have enough people to administer a large empire. They restricted Indian Ocean trade to those willing to pay a permit, but we'll talk a little bit later about how that's nothing new. Indian Ocean trade had always been heavily taxed. And in order to trade in the Indian Ocean, people always had to purchase permits to be involved. So now it is, instead of it being locals controlling the permits and taxes, it's the Portuguese. So again, Portugal is vulnerable and they don't hold power for super long because it's a small nation. The merchants eventually become corrupt. They're no longer paying the permits they need or paying the right people. Government officials start to skim money off the top. That's a common theme. And by the 17th century, they had major Dutch and English rivalries whose navigational technology had caught up. Eventually, Portugal is overpowered by England in India and the Dutch in Malacca, and they lose prominence in the Indian Ocean. They do try to go to Japan and bring missionaries. And again, like in China, it's successful at first, but also like China, Japan eventually closes their door to trade. And we see the waning of Portuguese influence in the Indian Ocean. So now let's talk about Spain and the Philippines and the lure of riches. So Portugal was the first Western European nation to reach the Indian Ocean by sea, but Spanish ships were the first to circumnavigate the globe. That means go all the way around the globe. This was sponsored by a man named Ferdinand Magellan. Spain eventually annexes Manila near the Philippines, and this becomes a huge Spanish commercial center. Manila is wildly important at this time in the Indian Ocean because of its location. It's very centrally located, not as influential, I would say, as Malacca, but very close. And the Spanish influence in the Philippines is incredibly important, and we see a lot of Filipinos becoming Christian. This kind of starts Spain's bug for exploration. So again, I'm going to say it a million times. Europeans wanted to find a waterway to Asia so they could find more gold and silver to support their mercantilist policies. They almost gave up. Spain makes it to the New World, but they don't really find a lot of gold. They start to abandon some of their North American colonies until finally they find silver in the Incans and Aztec empires. I want to highlight this word here, Amerindians. This is a word that you might see on the AP exam. It's American Indians. They just had to combine it and make it fancy. So once the discovery of silver in the Incan and Aztec empires is made, that really solidifies Spain's place in the New World because it made exploration and colonization profitable. It made it worth it. Europeans quickly begin using slave labor to grow crops in the land in the New World, which is incredibly fit for agriculture and to harvest valuable goods like silver. Let's talk China for just a second. China, upon the discovery of silver, immediately bought into the silver trade. China switches its currency to silver eventually. They want to get silver because they see how wildly rich silver makes places like Spain. That's key. Write that down. Silver changes Spain for a long time. Silver was transported on giant Spanish ships called galleons, and I have a picture of that on the slide. Galleons were huge. They were highly fortified. Their only job, or their primary job, was to carry silver. And basically, Spanish galleons would go to Manila, and they would trade European silver for Asian luxury goods. So Spain had the middle point in Manila. They had the galleons. They had all the silver in the Incan Empire, and they were finally able to cash in on that Asian luxury good trade. The Chinese government soon, like I said, shifted their currency to silver, and silver becomes a dominant force in the global economy. Highlight, underline, star, Spain becomes very rich. Let's talk France. France starts to sponsor expeditions in search of what is the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage is sort of a mythical thing. Everybody in Europe's looking for it. It's a waterway to East Asia and the East Asian trade from Europe. Now, we know that it doesn't exist in the way that they thought it exists because North America is there, but they're still looking for it. So we first see Jacques Cartier. He sails from the Atlantic Ocean to the northern United States, doesn't find the water route, but does claim part of what is now Canada for France. France eventually realizes there's a lot of resources in North America. They don't even need to go to Asia. They give up this search for the Northwest Passage because North America is so profitable to them. France becomes heavily involved in the fur trade. So like Russia was involved in the fur trade on the Russian part of the Asia, France is involved in the fur trade in North America. They established Quebec as a French fur trading post. Missionaries try to convert natives to Christianity with some varying successes. But the key difference between the French and the Spanish and the British is that the French did not settle permanently. They didn't go and start new lives. They went to trade. They went to make money. They weren't trying to make a new nation over in the New World. The French wanted to trade furs. They were pretty nice to the natives. They had a better relationship with the natives than the British did. But as a result of this, the French settlements in the New World grow much more slowly than the European settlements do in the New World. Let's talk England. England obviously also began searching for this Northwest Passage. We see the explorer John Cabot come over first. He claims lands in the New World. In what I believe is like the Florida area. That's like the first settlement. But England was unable to defend themselves against a strong Spanish armada, so they kind of struggle in the beginning. Eventually, however, England shockingly defeats the Spanish Armada, which is the giant fleet of Spanish ships. No one was expecting that, but they did, and this establishes England as the dominant naval force in the world, and they stay that way for a long time. As we all know, they go on to settle Jamestown, which is the first English settlement in 1607. It is settled by a joint stock company, which we're going to talk about more in a future topic, and later by those seeking religious freedom in like Plymouth. The Dutch also explore, again, looking for that Northwest Passage. A man named Henry Hudson comes over. He doesn't find the Northwest Passage. He thinks he does for a sec with the Hudson River, which is later named after him. But basically, he makes his way up into what is now New York. They establish New Amsterdam. This port is hugely prosperous because it is near waterways. Location is key. And they establish a Dutch colony that stays around for a good while. Over here, I have this handy chart that really lays out the different nations, why and where they explored. Let's talk about 4.3, the causes and events of exploration. That should say Columbian Exchange. That's another typo. That's my fault. So this is the Columbian Exchange, basically. What were the causes of the Columbian Exchange, and what was its effect on the Western Hemisphere? So we know Columbian Exchange. I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is where the Eastern and Western Hemisphere start to share not only goods, but diseases, foods, and animals. The Amerindians, again, that's a word you'll see for Native Americans or indigenous people, had no immunity to the diseases that were brought over by the Europeans, and their population was devastated. 50 to 90% of indigenous people were killed due to smallpox, measles, influenza, and malaria, and this is considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, population disasters in human history. They were so susceptible to these diseases, keyword, because they were isolated. They didn't have exposure to the European diseases, so they had no immunity built up, and it basically wiped out their populations. Before the Columbian Exchange, Native Americans actually ate very little meat. Pigs and cows and things like that are staples of our food today, but back in the day, they didn't exist here. So when these came into the American diet, it greatly changed the way people ate. The horse, even though it's synonymous with Native Americans, was also brought over by Europeans, and it changed a lot about Native cultures. It allowed natives to hunt over larger areas of land. For the first time, they have surpluses of food. They start to establish bigger settlements and things like that. But it also increases armed horseback interactions. So native tribes start clashing a little bit more because they have this weapon. The horse is basically a weapon. We start to see the rise of more native art and spirituality just because they have the time to do so, because they're no longer spending all of their time searching for food. Europeans took home corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, peppers, and cacao. A lot of these are staples of European diet. And the key thing to know about the introduction of these new foods is that it created a drastic increase in population in Europe. As we start to see the growth of colonization in Europe and the growth of agriculture, obviously we see the growth of forced labor. So, indigenous people were not suited to be forced labor, mostly because most of them were dying by disease, unfortunately, but also because they knew the land. They had support systems. They had friends and family that lived away. They could escape. So indigenous people were not as easy to subjugate, which is why we start to see the increase of African slaves being brought into the New World. Primarily, first of all, it was sugar. Sugar is what started the Atlantic slave trade in the way that we know it to be. Spain focused on silver, but Portugal focused on the cultivation of sugar. Sugar kickstarts that triangular trade, which is the trade between Europe, Africa, and the New World of goods and slaves. And we start to see the forced migration of Africans to cultivate sugar into the New World. Brazil primarily cultivated sugar. It is a very hard job. It sucks. It still sucks. I just watched a documentary about it. They still cultivate sugar basically in the same way they did back in the day. It is not an easy job. Lots of people died, and they had to continuously import these slaves from Africa. Particularly, they were taken from the Congo and the Swahili coast. So other parts of the world, like Spain, start to see that sugar is incredibly profitable. It runs the world for a while. It's even more profitable than silver for some places. So sugar really eclipses silver as the main moneymaker for Europe and the New World. Then we start to see the rise of crops like tobacco and cotton later on. So these cash crops dominate European trade. Silver first, well, not even. Sugar first. Sugar is the first thing that starts the slave trade. But people start exploring for silver, they stay for sugar. Let's talk just quickly about the African presence in the Americas. The forced movement of African people is known as the African diaspora. Africans were not able to bring their language to the New World for the most part because there were multiple languages spoken in Africa. You weren't guaranteed to be around Africans who spoke the same language as you. Often slaveholders did not allow them to speak their indigenous language. And for the most part, African languages were lost. We do see some syncretic syncretic languages like Creole, which is spoken in the southern United States still today. And that is a mixture of English and African languages. Music is the biggest piece of African culture that they are able to keep in the New World. We see slave spirituals are highly documented in our culture today, and music was really used as a survival technique. It kept people connected to their home, made people feel better. African music heavily impacted the North American culture at the time, or it was heavily assimilated. Food also was brought from Africa to the New World, like we said, okra and rice specifically. Different types of rice, and we see big influences on North American cuisine. Here is a couple of charts just about the Columbian Exchange, what went where. I feel like you guys have a pretty good idea of what went where and how it changed and impacted the land. The other thing to note about the Columbian Exchange is that the increase of agriculture led to things like soil depletion, deforestation, overgrazing by cattle. Obviously, disease wiped out a ton of people. There were lots of positive, lots of negative effects of the Columbian Exchange. So now is when we're really getting into sort of the bulk of information for this unit, 4.4 and 4.5. So if you have questions about any of this, please feel free to email me. But basically 4.4 is about how these empires and European states how they were established, and what economic and labor systems they used, how they grew because of their economic systems and labor systems. So one of the big things that we've already touched on briefly is the growth of trading posts. So Europe first establishes trading posts in Africa and Asia. Africa is trading posts are established by the Portuguese and Prince Henry the Navigator, who we've already talked about. Some African rulers realized that there was a real military advantage to interacting with these Europeans, so they started exchanging slaves for guns. African rulers would go into other weaker communities around them, capture people to trade into the slave trade, and in exchange would get military weapons that the surrounding regions didn't have. So it was like this cycle. They became stronger and stronger and stronger. They continued to steal slaves, and the areas around them became weaker. We start to really see European influences in Western art, West African art, and typically Europeans are depicted as intruders, not positively in African art. The Asante Empire and the Kingdom of the Congo really grow because of the way that they interacted with Europe, but they become heavily dependent on Europe, so this growth is not sustainable. The Portuguese take over ports on the Swahili coast, and essentially, as you know, the European influence in Africa created a real long term decline in African culture, and it made it hard for African governments to grow. As we talked about a bit in a previous topic, Japan was influenced by Portuguese traders because Christianity was brought in through missionaries. The Japanese didn't like this when Christianity grew too strong. They banned Christian worship. By 1630, foreign influence was heavily limited in Japan, with foreign books and travel being completely banned by the government. Japan, however, recognized that some trade was necessary in this growing global world, so they allowed some Dutch merchants to live in an island off the coast of Japan. And those were the only people that were really allowed to do any sort of trade with Japan, who was largely isolated. The Ming Dynasty does the same thing for the same reason. The growth of Christianity threatens Confucian beliefs, so they restrict the amount of trade that they can do, believing that China really was superior for the rest of the world, so they didn't need them. They prohibited foreign trade, destroyed dockyards, and limited the size of ships that could be built, and reconstructed the Great Wall. Remember that guy Zhang He? We talked about him in the last unit. He was the only Chinese explorer. He went far and wide and documented his travels really well. But after his travels ended, China put the kibosh on further exploration. We talked also about how European rivalries fueled a lot of exploration. And as these maritime empires grow, there's a lot of European clashes. They're fighting over economic, religious, and political power. India had numerous European powers set up inside of India, particularly the French and the British. This is after the fall of the Mughal Empire. They were focused originally on trade, and the first group to go into India was the British East India Joint Stock Company. Remember, that is a company that pays for trade. Private investors, so that's like an individual, like a person, invest into this company a little bit of money, and a whole bunch of people invest a little bit of money, and now they can afford to go and search and set up trading posts. So the East India Company goes into India, and initially they just are trading. They make friends with local rulers, they trade goods, but slowly over time, the East India Company starts to make treaties with political rulers and expand their influence. Great Britain does come to control most of the Indian subcontinent in this way. Portugal also traded a bit in India and controlled some trading posts. France did as well, but they were both eventually pushed out by Great Britain. By this time, with the Dominion of India, Great Britain is on its way to establishing a real global empire. Let's talk about Europe and how they interacted with the Americas. So Spain establishes New Spain. It is established by Hernando Cortez in the Spanish Empire. He defeats the Aztec Empire. Remember, he goes in, they discover that there's gold and silver in the Aztec Empire, and they really just sort of burn it down after that. They literally melt Aztec treasures down to send gold home. And unfortunately, they burned a lot of the indigenous books. So there's very little primary sources that exist about the Aztec or Incan empires today, which is a true travesty, because I'm sure that there was a lot of rich culture that we're missing out on because it was ruined by Europeans. In South America, Francisco Pizarro ransomed the Incan king. He said he'd give him back if they paid him a room full of gold, which they did. But surprise, they still killed him. Atahualpa, they still killed him, and the Spanish Empire totally overthrew the Incans by 1572. So Spain comes in, they erase the Aztecs, they erase the Incans, and they start to set up empires in this region. In the New World, Spain and Portugal clashed. They clashed so much that they eventually did the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which just split the Americas up, South America specifically. Alignment through South America down a meridian. Spain got everything to the west. Portugal got everything to the east, most notably Brazil. That is why Portuguese is the dominant language spoken in Brazil to this day. France and Great Britain also clashed in North America over who was going to get all this land that didn't really belong to them in the first place, but that's neither here nor there. The natives initially sided with Great Britain in North America. This is significant because obviously the natives were high in population, but they eventually switched sides to the French because they realized, remember, the French are not there to stay permanently. They're there to interact in the fur trade. The Iroquois catch on to that and eventually switch sides to the French. But over time, what is called the French and Indian War, Great Britain pushes France out of Canada. This is the same war as the 7 Years' War, which is the war that Great Britain pushed France out of India as well. So 7 Years' War, they get rid of France from India. French and Indian War, they get rid of France in North America. You should also hopefully remember from 8th grade that the French and Indian War is why Great Britain taxes the British colonies more. So they eventually revolt, all of that. Now, Europe in the Indian Ocean trade. So I touched a little bit on this previously, but Indian Ocean trade had existed for a long time, and Europe doesn't necessarily change trade in the Indian Ocean. They just change who controlled it. Merchants were used to having to pay taxes to participate in trade in the Indian Ocean. Portugal comes in. They have a very strong navy, as we discussed. They have a lot of religious zeal, which encourages them to fight. And they set up armed trading posts. They beat the Gujrats, the Mamluks, and the Zamorin of Calicut to establish this dominance. But they don't change much. People now are just paying their taxes to the Portuguese instead of locals. The Indian Ocean slave trade also had existed for centuries. This is a continuity in history. Indian Ocean slave trade was a bit different from Atlantic slave trade in a couple of ways. Primarily, it existed for a lot longer. Second, the slaves were taken from Africa and they were sent to North Africa, the Middle East, and India. And the slaves in the Indian Ocean network typically had a much different fate than the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade. They were more likely to work in homes as laborers or work in shipbuilding yards. They tended to live with other people, other slaves in towns or cities. They created diasporic communities with people who were like them from their own culture. And in some Muslim nations had some rights to even like marry. So this creates a huge spread of African culture into the Middle East and India. And that's very important to note. This slave trade brings African culture all over the world. Let's talk silver and gold. As I've said over and over again, silver is why people explore. Sugar is what makes people money. Sugar is what starts the slave trade. Silver is why European nations started to trade. They were looking for these mercantilist policies. They thought there was silver in the Caribbean. Psych, there wasn't. But then we see silver mining flourish in Peru, and they start to make a lot of money. Again, this is all kind of recapping stuff I've already said, but the indigenous people were not good slaves. They died, they could escape. So Spain kind of takes over the Incan Mita system, which enforces that all men have to work in the silver mines for a certain amount of time. They were kind of like paying tribute to the Spanish in the form of men to work in the silver mines. So the Spanish Empire grows very wealthy, but inflation eventually hurts their economy. We'll talk more about that later. So there are lots of different systems of coerced and forced labor. Obviously, we know about the slave trade. It existed first in the Indian Ocean and then in the transatlantic system. But Spain also sets up the hacienda and encomienda systems. The hacienda system and encomienda system are similar. The difference is that hacienda is when indigenous peoples were forced to work on farms to grow crops like wheat, fruit, vegetables, and sugar. And the encomienda system is closer to like the Russian serf system, where indigenous people said, hey, come work on my land and just live here forever and ever. Then also the Incan Mita system was another system put in by the Spanish. The African slave trade exists because they need a constant supply of labor into the New World. It is African people being taken. Some African kingdoms, like we talked about Asante and the Kingdom of the Congo, were involved in capturing the slave trade. The Middle Passage was terribly inhumane. That is the ship journey from Africa to the New World, and about 15% of slaves died just on the Northwest Passage alone. The demographics, or the people of Africa, were obviously heavily impacted. There were more men than women. This led to that idea of polygyny, which is where you have numerous wives to one husband. African governments were also just generally made unstable forever, generations to come. 4.5. We're in the home stretch, people. Maritime empires link regions. So, what economic strategies did maritime empires use to increase their power? So, we've talked about why they traded or why they grew. We've talked about the causes and effects. Now we're talking about money. So there are a couple main economic strategies that were used by European nations to fund exploration, but it's all started because of the commercial revolution. So once silver is found in the New World, the global economy shifts to one where gold and silver is used as the primary currency. This is known as the commercial revolution. Four things sort of played into this: the development of European colonies, the opening of new trade routes, population growth, and inflation. The high rates of inflation from all the gold and silver is called the price revolution. Inflation just means something used to be worth $1, and everybody had enough money, or most people had enough money to pay for that $1 thing. Well, now everybody has $10. So that thing that used to cost $1 now costs $10. So the buying power of money stays the same, but the prices of things go up. That is inflation. Another way that these European economies paid for exploration was through joint stock companies, like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. Essentially, these were companies where individuals, normal old people, middle-class people that had money to spend, invested small amounts of money into the joint stock company. Typically, if you invest money, you get money back. So they invest a small amount of money, a bunch of people do this, and now these joint stock companies go and trade in this global trade network, and they bring back profit to the investors. Joint stock companies had very limited liability. That means even if your investment didn't work out and you lose all of your money, you didn't invest very much, so it's okay, you're going to be fine. But typically, joint stock companies paid a good return, so lots of people were involved in them. And that's how places like the Netherlands and England were able to afford all of this travel and exploration. The Dutch also became incredibly wealthy. The Dutch were smart. They spent their money very well. They had a stock exchange where people were buying stocks in companies. It was the first stock exchange in the world. They had a giant bank that they could exchange currencies in. And they were sort of located as middlemen between European trade and Asian trade. So the Dutch were situated in a really good place, and they were very smart with the way that they handled this new wealth, which allowed the Dutch to become very wealthy. It's still a super wealthy part of the world today. The British and the French in the short term were less lucky because they were less smart. Banks lended too much money to individuals. It created an economic bubble, which eventually burst, hurting the British economy for a little bit. We know that they're not damaged forever, but they didn't handle their money quite as well as the Dutch. This is just a picture of triangular trade. Don't confuse it with the Columbian exchange. They're different, right? Columbian exchange is just New World, Old World exchange. Triangular trade is Africa, New World, Europe, and it includes the exchange of slaves. So let's talk about how life changed for indigenous people because of the growth of these maritime empires. Land-based empires had always had to deal with what to do with people they conquered. The Romans, the Muslims, the Mongols, they struggled. What do we do with all of these people that we've taken over their land? Most of the time, land-based empires allowed traditions to exist or assimilate into their culture, but maritime empires were really bad about erasing the cultures and social structures of the places that they had colonized. So they kind of went, and not only did they take over the land, they took over the culture and the society as well. Systems in Latin America were completely replaced by those of the Spanish and the Portuguese. For example, Spain appointed what is called a viceroy, and that's kind of like the king of the New World. They weren't kings, they answered to the king, but they were the most powerful person in the New World. They had audiencias, which were royal courts that people could appeal to, and they basically eliminated any system that had existed prior to that. Over time, though, Spain realizes that they're too far away. Communication is slow, and they don't try too much to establish a governmental system in the New World because it's just not worth it. Spanish is, however, the main language of this region today. We also start to see changes in religion for indigenous people. Obviously, we see Christianity come over. Christian missionaries are incredibly successful in Latin America, to the point where the Roman Catholic Church is still the most dominant church in Latin America. But we also see the introduction of Islam into the New World through African slaves. About 1 in 10 African slaves were Muslim, and this is the first Muslim population in the New World. So we see the politics of the New World change and the religion. 4.6, this is our last topic for this unit. Internal and external changes to state power, or challenges. So obviously, as these maritime empires grow, people don't like that. And we start to see challenges both from the inside of empires and from the outside of empires, with varying levels of success. So let's talk about some of these specific challenges and whether they were successful or not. Metacom's War is in the New World. It is an external challenge to European rule, and it is the last push of the Native Americans to push the British out of the New World. So a couple Native tribes get together, and they try to eliminate British influence. It is very unsuccessful. In fact, entire tribes become subjugated to the British people. The Fronde Rebellion took place in France. The Fronde were a group of nobles. They had a lot of power, and it was taken away as power in France became more absolute to the ruler, and they did not like that. So they rebelled against Louis XIV, and they lost horribly. This was an internal challenge to state power because it came from inside of France. The Maratha Rebellion was in Mughal India, and it was very successful. The Mughal Empire was known for religious tolerance, but towards the end of its reign, it was really not. And a Hindu warrior group rose up against the Mughal Empire, which was comprised at the time of a lot of Islamic rulers or Muslim rulers. They did not like that. So they create the Maratha Empire, which effectively ends the Mughal Empire. This is an internal dispute because it came from the inside, and it's pretty successful. The Pueblo Revolt was against the Spanish in what is modern-day New Mexico. This, again, is where native tribes are trying to push out the influence of the Spanish. The natives actually were initially very successful. They killed about 400 Spaniards, and for a couple years, they were able to eliminate the Spanish influence in the region. Spain, however, comes back in 1692 and is able to pretty much crush them and dominate that region for a long time. This is an external challenge to Spanish rule. So don't get confused that even though it happened away from Spain, that doesn't mean it's not external. It happened in the New World, but it was people fighting against the Spanish Empire. So the Haitian Revolution is very interesting. This is a slave revolution in what is now Haiti, and it is an external challenge to the French control of this land. The Haitian Revolution, this is key, is considered one of only 2 successful revolutions in the history of the world. Now, the history of the modern world. The other is the French, which we'll get into in the next unit. But the Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave revolution where an entirely free nation was established after a slave uprising. So their freedom was won by force. I've always thought that's a pretty interesting one. So that is an external challenge to French rule. They were successful. A couple more. We have Anna Nzinga in Africa. So she was a ruler of a place called Ndongo, and she was unhappy with the way that surrounding kingdoms in Africa were treating her, and she didn't like the Portuguese slave trade. So she decided to align herself with Portugal in an effort to win some independence and freedom. And she does. For a while, things are pretty good with Portugal, but they don't treat her well, they don't respect her, and she eventually breaks her alliance, flees west to establish a new country of Matamba, and from Matamba incites rebellions in Ndongo, allies with the Dutch, frees runaway slaves. She's basically like a really cool lady that does a lot of awesome stuff. She was able to resist Portuguese rule for a long time, and she ruled and created Matamba to become a pretty successful state for decades. That is an external challenge to Portuguese rule. So let's talk briefly about resistance in Russia. This is internal resistance. So throughout the 14th and 15th century, there are some wars that weaken the Russian central control, and the boyars, or the nobles, grow more and more powerful. We know that that doesn't work out for them. They continue to heavily tax the serfs, who are the poorest people in the land. They were tied to their land as slaves, and eventually, obviously, they become pretty upset about this. Runaway serfs band together over time, and they formed this mighty class of warrior called the Cossacks, who had had a sort of tumultuous relationship with the Russian Empire because sometimes Russian used them as a warrior class. But eventually, the Cossacks and this guy named Pugachev come together and they lead a peasant uprising. He actually pretends to be Catherine the Great's dead husband because remember, like, nobody had pictures of anybody back then. So he goes around, tells people he's Catherine's husband, says they should be loyal to him instead of her, and all this stuff. And they rebel against Catherine. They were upset with Catherine because she was giving even more power to the nobles than had existed before. So these Cossacks do this Pugachev's rebellion, and they were swiftly put down by Catherine. And she actually uses this as an excuse to gather even more totalitarian control against her people. So that one is not successful. Now let's talk about two more. So slaves in the Caribbean, like in the Haitian Revolution, fought to gain freedom in the Marin Wars. This is an external challenge to English rule in the Caribbean. The Marins were descendants of runaway slaves, and they do form independent settlements like the one that's under Queen Nani, but they're not as successful in the Haitians that they don't establish their own state. Also, in England, we see the Glorious Revolution. This is an internal challenge to state rule, and it is called the Bloodless Revolution because it was relatively peaceful. Basically, let's think back about these religious disputes that we've heard about. We see the very Catholic James I of England take control. He's super anti-Protestant, which made people pretty mad. The Protestants, who had gained power in time throughout England, invite his nephew and son-in-law, which is weird. He's his brother's son and also married to his wife, William of Orange, and his wife or daughter, Mary II, to invade England. They were Protestants, they agreed, but James I eventually steps down and peacefully passes on his power to William and Mary. This is called, again, the Glorious Revolution. It also gives a lot more power to Parliament. This revolution was bloodless, but we see tensions in Europe continue for a really long time. Again, here's a nice little chart that very briefly explains all of these internal and external challenges to state power. But basically, you just need to know that people were unhappy as the power of states grew. The end. Yay. Good job. I'm going to hit some highlights from this unit. I know I went through it really fast. Basically, silver, that's the whole deal, right? They start Europe wants to trade with Asia, get all these spices. Then they want to grow their silver stores to encourage their mercantilist policies. They make it to the New World, and they see that the New World is full of things that are even more valuable than silver, like sugar. This encourages the growth of the slave trade. The slave trade wildly spreads African culture around the world. And we start to see things like the rise of Dutch power through joint stock companies and a European domination, essentially. The final thing I want to say is that as Europe grows more powerful, we start to see Asian influence decline. And we start to see more challenges to state power, which our whole next unit is about revolutions. So that'll be that. But thank you for listening, and I hope that this was educational and fun.